Hello, welcome to EVN Report. My name is Titizian. Each month, we publish a security briefing called EVN Security Report. For the month of November, it was called Deterrence by Denial and Azerbaijan's Aggressive Opportunism. The author of our security briefings is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan. He's a professor of political science at UNLV. Welcome to the program again, Nerses.
Thank you for having me.
Following the September 13-14 Azerbaijani attack against the sovereign territory of Armenia, we saw growing Western support for Armenia and behind-the-scenes diplomatic pressure on Baku. In an attempt to counter Armenia's diplomatization of its security dilemma, you write that Baku is relying on three pillars. The first is intensifying aggressive and threatening rhetoric, amplifying hybrid operations, which we'll talk about in depth, I'm sure, in a bit, and obstructing the negotiation process, including all constructive attempts at mediation. These methods being utilized by Baku is what is qualified as aggressive opportunism. We need to understand also how Armenia is trying to mitigate Baku's aggressive opportunism. And by intensifying coercive mechanisms of its hybrid capabilities, Baku is diminishing Armenia's security environment and Artsakh's. It is doing this through four main methods in your report: provocation, compartmentalization, niche carving, and reputation building. Now, in the more than 48 hours, Azerbaijani so-called eco-activists have blocked the Lachin Corridor, which is the only lifeline that Artsakh has with Armenia and with the rest of the world. And late last night, we also found out that they had cut off gas supply, precipitating a humanitarian catastrophe in a matter of days if this issue is not resolved. Now, in the context of your security briefing, which was for November, and in light of what we are seeing today, how can we tie all of these pillars that you talked about, these hybrid mechanisms that Baku is utilizing, with what is actually happening today?
So the developments have been a bit concerning in the last 48 hours because we've seen Baku undertake a shift in its hybrid warfare methods. And so what we saw, as was discussed in September 13's broad-scale invasion, was a continuation of a broader strategy where Baku was targeting the Republic of Armenia, but had for some period of time refrained from targeting Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. And so we've seen a fluctuation where they shift operations from targeting the Republic of Armenia to targeting the Republic of Artsakh based on the level and magnitude of pressure that they receive or they're subjected to by the international community. And so what we have seen is basically Azerbaijan's attempt to mitigate the Republic of Armenia's attempts at various modalities of deterrence. Some of Armenia's deterrence capabilities have revolved and relied on, as we talked about, the diplomatization of its security, which has worked to some extent. And then for a very long period, as we've noted in our previous conversations and writings, Armenia's deterrence capabilities were reliant on Russia, which was known as extended deterrence. Now, we know that that collapsed after September 13th. And so what Azerbaijan is attempting to do is they're trying to stop or basically obstruct Armenia's ability to develop a new deterrence capability. This deterrence capability that I've been writing about, that we've been talking about, is known as deterrence by denial, where Armenia is developing levels of resilience, whether through diplomacy, whether through arms procurement, whether through the involvement of the international community, to deny Azerbaijan from achieving its objectives. So the more Azerbaijan is denied from achieving its objectives, the more they alter and change their hybrid techniques. And this is precisely what we are seeing in Lachin. So in this context, Azerbaijan realized that continued incursions into Armenia is creating severe international crisis for them. Their caviar diplomacy declined, to a large extent collapsed. The international community, especially the West, condemned them rather vigorously. So they've shifted gears. Now, how do we understand this shift, and how does that connect to the developments in Lachin? As you mentioned, I used four frameworks that are basically borrowed from the security literature to understand Baku's behavior. The Lachin Corridor situation is defined by two of the more important ones they're using. One concept is provocation, the other concept is compartmentalization. Provocation is very straightforward. We're kind of used to this, right? When Azerbaijan engages in behavior which they seek to provoke the opposing actor, whether that's Armenia or whether it's Stepanakert, specifically the leadership there, or in this instance, perhaps the Russian peacekeepers. But whatever the case might be, the objective of provocation is to basically elicit a desired response. Armenia has been very good in denying this, so it has not fallen to the trap of basically engaging in behavior that Azerbaijan desires. And so they have shifted to doing what they're doing. And so what is the desired response that they're seeking? What are they provoking in the recent activities that we're seeing in the Lachin Corridor? Well, they understand that this is very likely going to lead to a humanitarian crisis, but they're framing this more as an attempt of their so-called eco-activists, which are basically mostly made up of their special forces operatives, to create a situation that is untenable for Stepanakert, untenable for the Russian peacekeepers, and also becomes at some point untenable for Yerevan, forcing Yerevan to act. This is the provocation, the desired response that they're anticipating. And so those configurations remain very, very acute. The objective here is to see the Russian response. And so far, the Russian response could be qualified as one of tacit indifference. We're not seeing a rigorous response, and they are to some extent allowing the adversaries until now to get away with it. That suggests the somewhat success of this hybrid operation that Azerbaijan is pulling. It also suggests that the Russians were not quite ready or anticipating this. Of course, there are a lot of conspiratorial discourse on this we're not going to get into. But, fundamentally, we know that the Russian peacekeepers have the ability and the logistical know-how to address this. It's a question of political will. And
is it though, Nerses, let me just interrupt you. What is their actual mandate? Because, obviously, yes, the Azerbaijani side is provoking Stepanakert, Yerevan, and Moscow, but is their objective to escalate the situation, to engage the Russian peacekeepers, and to what end? I mean, again, this is speculation, but based on your experience.
And so the provocation objective, as you noted, to what end, the escalatory behavior, this falls into the conceptual framework of compartmentalization. And what this really entails is that, this is used extensively in the security literature, is that Azerbaijan engaged in compartmentalization by isolating the conflict into a domain where they have escalatory dominance. So in this context, what we're seeing is that Azerbaijan understand that they're struggling with Armenia at the international level because of diplomatization of security, and they're getting a lot of Western blowback. They have compartmentalized the conflict and brought into a domain that they have better escalatory capabilities. And this is precisely what they're doing in Lachin. And so the way this works is they can escalate and de-escalate based on the blowback that they receive. So the end objective at this point is, we know what the ultimate end objective is, but for the specific consideration of this hybrid activity that we're seeing Azerbaijan undertake, we can observe two main developments. One, Azerbaijan is engaging in reputation building by engaging compartmentalization. What they're doing is that they're telling the world, look what the Russians are doing to the territories that belong to the Republic of Azerbaijan. Look how the Russians are blocking our activists. Look how Russians are creating problems. And so by basically creating this artificial anti-Russian narrative to the West, while at the same time working with the Russians on other projects, they're attempting to build a reputation in the West that, in essence, Azerbaijan is some kind of a fulcrum or a buffer against Russian interests in the region. Again, we all know this is not true, but it is a mechanism of reputation building. So one objective of this hybrid activity is to basically message to the West that, listen, see, we have the courage to challenge the Russians. Now, at the same time, of course, while they're engaging some level or attempting to engage in some level of reputation building, we are also seeing an attempt by them to reestablish and reassert control over the Russian corridor indirectly. And so what this does is this further squeezes Stepan Akyat and places them in an impossible position, i.e. having a humanitarian crisis. And it's also if a humanitarian crisis is triggered based on the magnitude, this will also force Yerevan to act. And so by having escalatory dominance within this specific domain, Azerbaijan is attempting to engage in reputation building, also to provoke Yerevan, where Yerevan will engage in a behavior that is desired for Azerbaijan, and they could utilize that to justify any other mechanisms of escalation that they want to engage in. So there's a multi-tiered hybrid strategy here, where it's not simply about these activists or closing of the Lachin Corridor, but rather the responses that these will produce and how Azerbaijan will manipulate or basically capitalize on those responses to further escalate their hybrid activities.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but we were discussing this yesterday, Nerses. The reaction and actions of the Russian peacekeepers is, for lack of a better word, strange. First of all, we had a group of Azerbaijani so-called eco-activists there. They tried to block the road. The Russian peacekeepers have not engaged, but could they not have allowed them to keep protesting, but kept a lane open to allow, the free movement of people? Because as we know, there are thousands of Artsakhis, Armenians of Artsakh, who are now stranded, who can't get back. There are children who have been separated from their parents. It seemed that they said, okay, come, and then they allowed more buses of activists to come and sort of, bolster that crowd. How do you explain that?
There's basically a few ways of looking at it. From a constructive lens, one could argue that the Russians are attempting to de-escalate the situation. And so by not giving in to the Azeri provocations, they're in their own attempt, they're trying to de-escalate, hoping behind the scene negotiations will eventually lead to diffusion of the situation, and thus the roads will be opened. This is what they did the first time, which the Azeris closed the road. But we knew that when this happened the first time, it was part of a broader hybrid strategy, and they were basically setting precedent. So the Russians should have anticipated this. And so at this point, I don't think that the de-escalatory mechanism will work. And so this also brings up the important question you brought up, isn't this a little baffling? Now, do the Russian forces have the physical capabilities to remove the protesters, so-called protesters? Of course they do. Okay, and so, but the concern is, what is the rational thing, a calculus? What is the cost-benefit analysis coming out of Moscow? Do they want to risk basically at some level harming relations with Baku for the sake of the Artsakh Armenians? Okay, this is a question that needs to be posed. Why aren't the peacekeepers doing what they're capable of doing and fulfilling their duties in the territories that they have a mandate to control? These modality of behavior might not be mandated, but the control of the territory is mandated under the November 9 trilateral ceasefire. And why aren't they doing that? And further in that context, as we see the Russian peacekeepers allowing protesters to be bussed in, do they have lack of command from the higher ups to confront this? Or the higher ups have made a calculation that allowing this crisis to continue for a temporary period of time is beneficial as opposed to directly confronting Baku and having some kind of a Baku-Moscow fallout. So the configurations obviously are multi-tiered. From Moscow's lens, their concern isn't the population of Artsakh, isn't the issue of providing open, roads, road of connection from Yerevan, from Armenia to Artsakh. That is secondary. The primary objective of the Russians is to basically maintain their interests, and in this context, not to harm relations with Baku for the sake of Artsakh Armenians. Now, once Russian interests are harmed, where the escalatory behavior reaches to an extent which Moscow considers the cost-benefit analysis is harmful to them, then we may anticipate a response. But we have not gotten there yet. And the fact that Azerbaijan reverted to another hybrid mechanism of cutting off the gas, this clearly suggests that they're being very careful in confronting the peacekeepers. They're limiting the escalatory behavior, but what they're doing is they're engaging in collective punishment of the civilian population of Artsakh, which basically diverts the scope of responsibility from the Russians, because at the end of the day, the head of the Russian peacekeeping force could basically argue, well, we can't control the gas pipelines, so this is a whole different modality of conversations that need to be had, negotiations that need to be had, but it's outside of our scope of responsibility. And so Azerbaijan is basically attempting to both provoke responses, but also play between the lines where they could mitigate the fallout. The underlying concern here is that if Moscow isn't stepping in, and if Stepanakert does lack the agency to engage, and any involvement by Yerevan will be viewed as an act of escalation and thus trigger interstate dispute, how do we proceed with this? This is the very, very important objective. And this is why Azerbaijan has been very good at compartmentalizing, right? This is why they have moved this to their domain, where every escalation is a process for which they control. And this is why it's both tricky, but at the same time, for most Armenians, very frustrating. But this is something that we need to understand, right? We need to understand how they operate to be able to develop resilience against it.
Okay, it seems that we are forever reacting to the steps that Baku is taking. Is there no way that we could have foreseen this latest escalation when last week they attempted and they did block the Lachin Corridor for 3 hours? So they were testing their abilities, their capabilities to do that. And coupled with that, you were saying that they are trying to provoke a response from Yerevan. Realistically, what can Yerevan do?
At a broader level, the majority of activities that Yerevan can engage is what they've been doing, heavily diplomatic. But to some extent, there has been some preemption by Yerevan in that diplomatically informed the international community that something of this sort is pending. And so the fact that we got a fairly quick response from the European Union, the fact there was a very quick and a rather vigorous response from the United States is suggesting that we did preempt. So this was not mostly reactive, that we had been basically hinting and working at a whole shaping of a narrative that should this happen, we can advance the discussion. And this is what we're seeing. Physically, materially, substantively, unless Yerevan is ready to initiate another war or engage in broad conflict, we remain limited at this point. But that could never be part of the configuration, because this is why you have the November 9 trilateral ceasefire. That ceasefire was precisely signed so that we would not be having this discussion, that a peacekeeping contingent will maintain the peace. So we can't be speaking of having a peacekeeping contingent, but at the same time saying, what could one of the parties do by virtue of force or physical activity to address a problem? So that creates a contradiction. One conversation that we are having is a discussion with our Western partners, should there be an international humanitarian airlift into Stepanakert if this continues? Because what do you do when you have a humanitarian crisis, right? What do you do when the peacekeepers are not solving the problem and the predatory state is precisely designing modalities of activity that are seeking to achieve a certain objective, where an entire population of 120,000 people are either freezing, having access to medicine, food, so on and so forth. So any humanitarian disaster would require an international response. So another thing that Yerevan could do is to actively work to both internationalize the issue and also demand some kind of an international airlift of assistance to Artsakh, because this is not a sustainable approach.
Hasn't Baku threatened that they will shoot down any kind of airplane, whether it's a humanitarian airlift or otherwise?
Yeah, good luck shooting down a UN helicopter. Good luck shooting down a Western. No, that is they're bluffing. Obviously, they will shoot down anything that Yerevan sends. Okay, but they're not going to shoot down anything that the Russians send, for example, or any other international actor. So in that context, I don't think they're gonna. That would basically negate the entire objectives and the well-developed grand strategy that they have. So they're not going to mitigate a fallout to that extent. But I think something of that magnitude will definitely lead Baku to back off of this, because the last thing they need is for the issue of Artsakh to be further internationalized, because they keep claiming this is a domestic and internal issue. So one thing Yerevan could do is to intensify the internationalization of the humanitarian crisis.
Okay, you talked briefly about the statements that came out of Brussels and Washington. Very strong statements about opening the corridor, about the cutting off of the gas. In your November briefing, you said that in an attempt to counter Armenia's diplomatization of its security, and you're saying this is not the only, but the main tool that Yerevan has in its hand is to get the international community, the West, to issue statements, to get involved. The more statements, and we've kind of heard this from some people that let's not provoke Aliyev. Let's not instigate more of these kinds of hybrid activities, these provocations, these attacks. So it's like you're kind of stuck in a situation where you know that this is the tool, the only tool you have, and yet this tool is now precipitating these kinds of actions that we're seeing on the Lachin Corridor.
Well, so
you see the conundrum that I'm just trying to see from the
absolutely,
outside.
absolutely. So a couple of points there. The statements that you're talking about, these are being made by certain international actors who are attempting to keep the negotiating process going. So they fear, and these are mostly certain figures out of Europe, they fear that if they antagonize Aliyev, he will just walk away from negotiations. That we saw that he did on September 7th when he refused to have Macron involved. And this is part of Azerbaijan's objective as well. So the Europeans, when they talk about that, their whole thing is we don't want to fall into one of the traps of them using reason not to engage in negotiations. And so in order not to fall into the provocations, we tend to ignore those provocations and try to be more constructive. And that is the objective. But Azerbaijan, of course, understands that. And so the sort of the interesting component of their multi-level strategy is to do precisely that. So to create a conundrum, as you said, a bit of this paradox where the Europeans want to have them in the negotiations, but also not to alienate them. But at the same time, Azerbaijan manipulating that to basically get things going. So they put the international actors, Europeans, sort of this catch-22, right? If Europeans condemn them, Azerbaijan feigns outrage and they leave the talks. The Europeans are very careful. Then Azerbaijan says, well, we didn't do anything that bad because, what's coming out of Brussels isn't very aggressive. So they're playing this very, very well. But behind the scenes, nobody's blind. The fact that, this is what I want to kind of get to, the fact that neither the American statement or the European statement even recognizes so-called eco-terrorist things, they're kind of eco-terrorists, but these eco-activists, right, that neither the Europeans or the Americans are even talking about mining issues, environmental issues, clearly shows that these hybrid narratives that are being produced by Baku isn't working. So nobody's blind. That's why both spoke about the humanitarian concern, the blocking of the road, and Americans just recently had a statement come out about the issue of cutting off the gas. And so Baku's game plan has become pretty straightforward. But neither Europeans nor the Americans, regardless of the magnitude of strength that their statements might have, but what this is leading to is behind the scenes, they are understanding that, in essence, what Azerbaijan's objectives are. That's where they start speaking about a humanitarian crisis, whereas in the past, they didn't use the word crisis or disaster because they were still hopeful that the approach would be different. And so the diplomatization of security, the intense work that is being done by the Armenian side is to basically change the perspective, which is so far starting to bear fruit that, Baku is not only an unreliable negotiating partner, but look at what's being developed, right? In any context you look at, there's no justification for cutting off gas in the middle of winter to 120,000 people. That is not in any way, in any scope, in any discourse, a mechanism of that could be justified. And so these conversations that we're seeing coming out of the various capitals, nobody's blind to this. And I also think that even though Baku might be using that as some kind of a negotiating leverage, it is going to shoot itself into the foot because What it's allowing Yerevan to do is we're able to take this conversation and say, listen, this is no longer a conversation about territory, territorial integrity, sovereignty, so on and so forth. It's very clear what this is, right? This is a humanitarian issue, and Azerbaijan's behavior pretty much speaks to this.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to say. They put forward a narrative and then they shot themselves in the foot by cutting off the gas. Nerses, thank you for helping us understand a little bit more about what is taking place. Definitely looking forward to the December security briefing. There's never an absence of things to write about, unfortunately. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you again in about a month's time.
Thank you for having me. Always happy.